blue is not. Did a lot of collecting on the Galapagos Islands. Darwin was not, at this point in his life as a young man, as meticulous as he should have been. He did not take as good of notes as he would later wish he had. And some of his specimens were unidentified. They were just sort of kind of thrown into a box from the Galapagos, but they didn't know exactly which island they had been collected on. And he sort of cursed his lack of precision for the rest of his life when he was trying to revisit some of those specimens. They left the Galapagos over to New Zealand and Australia, visiting Tasmania, around the Cape of Good Hope, back to the edge of South America, and then returning home to Great Britain. I like to put this list of books up here. Again, I said I'm not a name and dates in person. I'm not going to ask you any of these book titles, but I like to make sure that I remind you that Charles Darwin actually wrote many books, not just on the origin of species that we think about so much. This was The Voyage of the Beagle, which was sort of the travel novel or travel journal of the time. Many people read about his work that was much more about the travel and the adventure of the voyage. His next book didn't come until 20 years later, when he wrote On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. He later wrote a book about the evolution of humans and the expression of emotion in animals. He was also one of the first people to study earthworms and wrote a book on earthworms and several other things, and actually did experiments with his children. And so his children are published on some of his works as well as some of his scientific papers. And so he did a lot of experiments and writing that we don't know him for necessarily. We sort of always focus in on the origin of species. And the story always sort of goes that Darwin was spending a lot of time thinking a lot about what he had observed and what he believed. He was writing letters to colleagues and saying, you know, as I traveled around all of these places, I found these groups of organisms that are similar but not the same. I found that island species are similar to mainland species, but they are unique, and each island has its own suite of species that seem to be specialized to that island. I found that this is true across birds and across tortoises and across iguanas and lots of species groups. And I'm not sure what all this means, but I think it means that species change to suit their environment. And I wonder how that works. And you spend a lot of time trying to figure out how that works. And so he came to his description of evolution by natural selection as a means by which this could happen. So he had this observed pattern that he saw, data that he had collected, and he wanted to know what could cause that pattern. And natural selection was his answer. But he died still looking for the actual physical thing. And what he needed was to communicate with Mendel, right? Because what he needed was the genetics component. That was the piece he was missing. He had this idea about how it might work. He had this mechanistic approach, but he didn't know what the actual thing was that allowed it to happen. And the thing that allows natural selection to happen are genes. And he really would have liked to have known about genes in his lifetime. It would have given him a lot more satisfaction in his ideas if he could get that actual mechanism for how things worked. So Darwin had been thinking about this and writing about this for a long time and communicating with friends, and he had his notes and sketches and ideas he'd put together, but he didn't really think he had it figured out well enough to present to the world until Alfred Russel Wallace came along. Alfred Russel Wallace was a little bit younger, and he is another evolutionary thinker. Like Darwin, he had traveled extensively, visited lots of places, and observed patterns in those places. He worked a lot in Malaysia, and he's known for other things besides natural selection. He discovered warning coloration, the idea that organisms that are brightly colored are advertising that they might be noxious or poisonous. He was the father of biogeography, which basically looks at where organisms are in space throughout the Earth and how they're related to each other and what that means for geological history. And then he was the co-discoverer of natural selection. So he was thinking also about this mechanism that might cause the patterns that he was observing as he traveled. And he had some ideas, and so he actually wrote to Darwin. Somebody said, I think there's this other guy that's thinking similar things to what you're thinking. You should write to Darwin. And so he wrote to Darwin, and he basically outlined the exact same ideas Darwin had been thinking about and said, what do you think? I think maybe this is how the world works. And Darwin was like, crap, I'm going to get scooped by this youngster, right? I'm going to lose all this thing I've been thinking about for 30 years. So they ended up both presenting their idea together. They delivered separate papers at the same conference. And so they really both, probably Darwin had been thinking about it earlier and longer, but they both independently came to natural selection as a mechanism for the process of evolution to occur. So I want to spend a little bit of time just talking about what that mechanism is, and then we'll maybe move on to something a little bit more interesting, like how speciation occurs. I feel like you guys, you need to stand up and stretch. Maybe this is boring, huh? Okay, I'm losing you. I don't know what to do. Let's talk about the actual mechanism of natural selection. So both Darwin and Wallace kind of came to this understanding. Darwin was heavily influenced by Thomas Malthus and especially by Lyell. Lyell was a little bit of one of his heroes, the geologist. He said that in order for this process to work, we have some criteria. And the first of those criteria is that members in a population have to be variable, right? We can't all be clones of each other and cookie cutters of the same organism. We have to be variable throughout our population. And so if you look, this particular picture is all of members of the same species of ladybird beetle, right? These ladybugs are all the same species, but they look very different. Some have darker elytra, some have lighter, some have big spots, some have small spots, some have many spots, some have few spots, but they're all members of the same population. Okay, so there's a population here that is highly variable. The second criteria is that some of those traits have to be heritable, right? We have to be able to pass the trait from parent to offspring. So when I was talking about Lamarck and the muscle baby, right? You can't directly pass your fitness onto your offspring, your physical fitness. But you might be able to pass on some genes that make it easier for you to put on muscle mass, right? That would be something that would be heritable. And so some of those traits are heritable. Things that we know to be heritable in our human population, things like skin color and eye color and hair curliness and height, right? All of those are things that vary throughout our population that are passed in some form from parent to offspring. Remember that these ideas are being formulated before we understood genetics, before we understood Mendel's work. Mendel was a contemporary of Darwin's, but Darwin didn't understand his work. Before we knew what genes were, before we knew what DNA was, and so there has to be something that's heritable that can be passed from parent to offspring. And then, sort of like Malthus, in our over-reproduction, right? Not just humans, but all species have the capacity to produce more offspring than the environment can support. And generally speaking, the majority of species do in fact produce more offspring than the environment can support. And because of that, not all offspring can survive because resources are limited, right? If we have too many individuals, we're going to run out of food, we're going to run out of shelter, disease is going to transmit more rapidly, and some individuals will not survive. So all species can produce more offspring than their environment can support, and resources are limited, and not all offspring will be able to survive. You guys have that? The third criteria for each generation, some individuals survive and others do not. Okay, I sort of said that in the previous slide, but it's separate criteria. For every generation, not all members of that generation will survive. Some will survive and some will not. I like this picture because this is actually an adult ladybug getting ready to eat a juvenile ladybug of the same species. right? And so sometimes your own survival maybe is going to be more valued than the survival of your offspring or your friend's offspring in this case. And then that leads us to this fourth criteria, which is that the likelihood of surviving and reproducing is not based on chance or luck. Okay? The characteristics that an individual has either make it more likely to survive or less likely to survive. Okay? And that is really the heart of natural selection. So the process of natural selection is that those individuals that have advantageous traits are going to leave more offspring to the next generation. They will live longer and produce more offspring than those individuals who have traits that are not advantageous or traits that are not suited to the environment that they find themselves in. Okay? So populations are variable. Some of that variation is heritable. Populations and individuals produce more offspring than can survive. Resources are limited, and not all offspring survive. And survival is not due to chance or luck, but based on the characteristics that the individual has. Okay. Those things together are natural selection. Right? Individuals with advantageous traits leave more offspring to the next generation than those that don't have advantageous traits. Okay. What does that mean to have an advantageous trait? Right? Is there like one best set of characters that every single ladybug should have? No, there isn't, right? That best characteristics, those advantageous traits, are specific to the environment the organism is living in, specific to that specific population, right? Changes over time, changes over space. So it's not like evolution is creating the perfect ladybug or the perfect organism. Instead, the environment that that organism finds itself in is going to shift what the next generation can look like. Okay? And so you have a change from one generation to the next generation towards being better suited to the environment. And when the environment changes, then those traits that are considered ideal are also going to change. Right? Does that make sense? Okay. So when we talk about this having advantageous traits and passing those traits on from one generation to the next generation, we use the term fitness. And I want to make sure that I describe what fitness is, because we think of fitness as like I can run a lot on the treadmill or I have really big muscles, right? And evolutionarily, that's not what we mean. Evolutionarily, fitness is some combination of the probability of survival and the likelihood of reproduction. And reproduction drives your fitness value more than anything else. Okay? So those individuals who are fit contribute more to the next generation. That's really the crux of fitness. The more fit you are, the more offspring you will leave in the generation that comes after yours. Okay? Sometimes that comes by living a very long life and producing lots of offspring throughout your lifespan. But it could also mean that you have a fairly short life, but you made a lot of babies in the time that you were there. Okay? And you had a good contribution to the next generation, even though your life was not particularly long. And so to exemplify that, I like to use these two bison, because in many species of herd animals, there are sort of two competing strategies that happen within those herds. Many large grazing herbivores like bison, like elk, have a population structure where only some males in the population mate, and most of those males gain access to mating with females through some kind of competition. And so they win some competition, or they are the largest in size, and therefore they get to do the majority of mating. And other males in the population might live their entire life without having any mating opportunities, okay, depending on the structure of the particular species. In bison, There are dominant males who get access to most of the females for mating purposes, and those dominant males tend to remain dominant through a period of years in which they get to produce lots of offspring, and then they be sort of past the reproductive age and go into old age and die shortly after that. Okay. So here I have sort of unfair pictures. I picked those pictures to make my point. This is an older male for sure. He is actually beginning to, or well, almost finishing shed. So we're getting into summer. So we've been shedding out the winter coat. So he's looking kind of raggedy with this coat shedding. But also you can see what happened there. You can see his ribs. Right? And you can see a divot in front of the hip bone. That's an animal that is at low body weight. Okay? That often happens in animals that are old or animals that are sick. This animal is sort of in its prime. It's very filled out. You can't see the ribs. You see very little divot in front of the hips. Good body weight, good condition. This is actually going into the end of the summer as the rabbit brush are dying back. But he's in really good shape in his body condition. Some bison will mate as much as they can each season at some sort of moderate amount, regulating their reproductive effort relative to their food effort. And at the end of the summer, getting ready to go into fall and winter, they look like this. They're fit, they've been eating a lot, they're going into their mating season, they're going to continue to eat through the mating season so that when winter comes, they have enough fat reserves to get through the winter. Some males worry less about eating and more about finding mates. And so I was actually working on an island with a bison population, and it was sort of late winter. And I was hiking along, and there was a bison laying on the side of the road, and I was like, ooh, he doesn't look very good. I think he might be sick. And I went over and checked, and he was actually dead. And so I called up the park ranger, and I'm like, you know, this bison's out here. He's dead on the side of the road. This is his tag number. I don't know what happened. Maybe you want to get the disease team out here to test and see what happened. And he's like, I know what happened to that bison. That's that young bull who rutted like crazy last fall, and he didn't eat enough. And that's exactly what happened. When we did the necropsy, his body fat was so low. He literally starved to death over the winter because in the previous year, he made so much effort to mate that he didn't eat, didn't put on enough weight to get through the winter, didn't survive to the next season. So in his first year of mating, he maybe got as many offspring as a more cautious male would get in a long lifetime. So he still has really high fitness, but he's lived a very short life. Okay. So my point here is that there are different strategies, and ultimately what drives your fitness is how many offspring you get in the next generation. And so you may live a very short life and have a lot of reproductive effort and have high fitness. You may live a very long life and have high reproductive output and have high fitness. Okay? You may live a long life and never have any offspring, and your fitness is practically zero. You've other than through cousins and nieces and nephews, you've contributed none of your genes to the next generation directly. Okay. So fitness is really driven by reproductive output. Okay, that unequal fitness, that's the crux of natural selection, right? Some individuals have higher fitness than others. It means that the population is going to shift towards the characteristics of those individuals that have the greatest reproductive output. Maybe that means that it's a behavioral strategy to have a lot of mating early in life. Maybe it means it's a behavioral strategy to put on good body mass, right? Whatever it is that in that population is what's going to be pushed forward to the next generation. Sorry, this is a wordy slide. Guys, mostly have this? Okay. These are all up on Moodle now, by the way. Okay. Natural selection is one of the forces of microevolution. We're going to talk about the other microevolutionary forces in subsequent chapters. But natural selection is the only process that results in adaptation. Okay? Adaptation is when characteristics enhance an organism's fitness in the environment. Any characteristic that helps an organism to be successful in its environment can be characterized as an adaptation. Okay. Those of you who've had me before know that I might be just a little bit obsessed with kangaroo rats. You will probably never see one. They don't live in New England. This is a Western species. I took this picture in Nevada, but they're kind of my favorite charismatic microfauna. Definitely one of my favorite organisms. So I'm going to use kangaroo rats as an example of adaptation. So one of the adaptations that kangaroo rats that help them to be really successful living in the desert is that they have external fur-lined cheek pouches. These cheek pouches allow them to gather lots of food that they can store. Because in the desert, food is produced in 1 or 2 pulses per year. So it's like you have to do all your grocery shopping for the entire year in 1 week, right? So you've got to be driving back and forth to the grocery store, grabbing everything and storing it in your house, right? They are using their cheeks as grocery bags. So they go out and gather all the food that's available, and they bring it in and store it in their burrow or bury it in little caches. So the cheek pouches are really important for transporting, but the fact that they're external and fur-lined is super important for their water balance. So when they put these seeds into their cheek pouches, they're not losing salivary moisture to the seeds. Okay, they're not losing any of their moisture in the transport process. That external outside of the mouth is very beneficial for an animal that lives in the desert. The fact that the pouches are fur-lined further prevent too much contact between the skin and the seeds. So they're preventing moisture exchange while they're transporting seeds. Okay. Many species of kangaroo rats actually actively maintain their seeds by moving them to different positions in their burrow and keeping them at just the right level of environmental moisture. So if the seeds start to get too wet and they might mold, they move them to a drier part of the burrow. If they start to get too dry and they're going to be a loss when they eat them, they move them to a wetter part of the burrow. And so they're actually actively maintaining that soil, that moisture in their seeds. Okay. Kangaroo rats also have a really long rostrum and huge auditory bullae. So here's the skull of a chipmunk and the skull of a similar masked kangaroo rat. The auditory bullae here are the resonating chambers for sound. I should just use the pen instead of my finger. So these are the auditory bullae on the chipmunk. These are the ones on the kangaroo rat that allows them to hear much better than a rodent of similar size. A kangaroo rat can actually hear an owl's wing beat as the owl flies through the air and evade that predator. They also have very long nose relative to a chipmunk's nose. This rostrum is full of chambers of cartilage. So as they breathe in, the air moves through those chambers and it is warmed and moistened in the nose before it goes into the lungs. The lungs are very wet surface for respiration. They're really worried about water balance. So they want to make sure that the air is not too dry when it comes in. And when they exhale, they reclaim moisture from that air and they dry it out as they move it back out so that they don't lose too much moisture to respiration. Okay, so those are both adaptations for where they live. And then the last one is that they have most complex and longest documented in their urinary system. It means that they're really, really good at reclaiming water from their digestive processes before they go out into the external environment. Okay. I'm not going to test you on kangaroo rats, but these are adaptations. Like these are the results of generations and generations and generations and generations of natural selection, right? These are really specific things. You don't get that tightly aligned to your environment unless you've been evolving in that environment for a long time. Right? These organisms would not necessarily be an advantage if this environment changes rapidly. Right? If all of a sudden the desert became tropical, these adaptations wouldn't be any use to them. Right? If a tropical animal all of a sudden found itself in this desert, without these adaptations, it would be hurting. Right? So that's just an example of some adaptations. Okay. The last thing I want to say about natural selection, before I just sort of wrap up natural selection, is that we can think about how natural selection works through artificial selection. Okay, so we know that the ancestor of modern domestic dogs is something that is also the ancestor of modern wolves. Right? And it's very wolf-like in its characteristics. It's not an actual wolf because wolves have been evolving the whole time that we've been domesticating dogs. Right? But the ancestor of domestic dogs is a wolf-like beast. So if we go from this wolf-like beast to all of these domestic dogs, some of which are huge, some of which are tiny, some of which have normal functioning respiratory mechanisms, others which have these smashed up faces which can't thermoregulate and have really disastrous respiration, right? All of those things have happened by selecting for the characteristics that humans wanted. Right? We wanted larger dogs or smaller dogs. We wanted a particular look. A particular body shape was advantageous to the job the dog was doing for us, right? Those same mechanisms that we use to push dog populations are really analogous to what happens in the natural world, right? A pug would never be the result of natural selection because they're just so ill adapted to life in general. They only exist because we think they're adorable and we love their little grunting sounds, right? But we can sort of mimic natural selection through our artificial selection processes. We can get a great diversity of organisms from one starting point. Okay? Any of you who garden maybe have grown all of these things in your food garden, right? Cabbage, Brussels sprouts, kohlrabi, kale, broccoli, cauliflower are all a single species. The wild ancestor of all of those domestic food products is Brassica oleracea, a common wild mustard that looks like this, right? None of these foods look like this ancestor. If you select just for terminal buds, you can turn this into cabbage. If you select just for leaves, you can turn this into kale. This mustard has pretty small leaves, right? But we can turn it into big, showy, bushy kale leaves just by choosing generation after generation after generation the traits that we want. Now, artificial selection is really intentional. We're trying to get a product as humans for ourselves, for our goals, right? Natural selection is not goal-oriented, but it works in a similar way. Those traits that are advantageous get reinforced for the next generation, and again in the next generation, and the one after that, right? Oh, hold on. I'm missing a slide. Well, so I was going to summarize by saying that natural selection is not goal-oriented, right? The environment is not trying to create the perfect cabbage, right? But the environment is impacting survival and reproduction generation after generation after generation. Individuals don't evolve, right? You either survive and reproduce or you don't, right? If you're a prey organism and you get eaten, that's the end of your story, right? You don't evolve to run faster. It's the offspring of your generation that run faster that make it, right? And then contribute to the next generation. So individuals don't evolve in a biological context, right? We as humans might evolve in our thinking, our psychological processes, but we don't evolve in our biology. It's the population that actually changes over time. Okay? And we'll look at those mechanisms and how they impact a population. Mm-hmm. That's a great question. We wouldn't consider that artificial selection because artificial selection is by definition human-driven. But it is definitely true that, so Haley is asking about this situation where ants actually actively farm aphids. They will protect their aphids that they use as a food source. The aphids provide sugar to the ants. The ants will move the aphids to a better food source so that they produce more sugar. They'll protect them against other organisms. And so that interaction is selecting for both of those species, right? That interaction is impacting both species. Those aphids that are better might actually get more attention from their ants and have higher or longer survival because of that, or have higher reproduction. Those ants that are more effective at manipulating their farmed aphids may have higher nutrient levels, right? Ants are a little bit harder to select because of their whole crazy eusociality and only the queen breeds and all of that. But they're essentially all clones in a population anyway. So, but yeah, we wouldn't call that artificial selection, but it's fascinating to think of it from an ant perspective, right? Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, right. I think that the line is humans for me. And I think that you are welcome to draw your own line. But I think I would say that, like, native peoples starting and managing fires, like promoting and reducing certain species, they are a selective force in their population, in their ecosystem, right? Just like, more modern cultures are selective forces in their population. Starting a fire, building a parking lot, both habitat destruction, right? Different consequences, maybe more severe consequences for the ecosystem, but both forces. And so in those cases, we would be sort of a force of disturbance or a force of destruction as opposed to a natural selective force. Artificial selection really, I think definitionally, is about a goal-oriented process to produce a product. We're definitely selective forces in the ecosystems we live in. Okay. So artificial selection is sort of the beginning of some evidences for evolution. We've only got 7 more minutes. I'm going to go through some of the evidences of evolution. And the first of those is the fossil record. So we started to look at fossils when we were looking at our evolution of evolutionary thinking. Loosely, we'll refer to fossils, we'll use the term fossils for any kind of preserved remnants or impressions of organisms that lived in the past. So sort of traditional true fossils are those things where the living tissue has been replaced by minerals. But we also have all sorts of other forms of evidence, like things that are preserved in amber, things that are preserved in rat urine, right? Those organisms, the mammals that form middens, tend to actually urinate on the things that they collect in their middens, and we can actually germinate several hundred-year-old seeds out of rat middens and see what those seeds are like compared to what exists modernly. As we are going through a massive period of climate change right now, lots of ice is melting and all sorts of things are coming up out of the ice, right? Viruses and bacteria are coming up out of the ice. Mummies are coming up out of the ice. And so we have icemen, we have mammoths, all sorts of things are sort of melting out that are evidence of previous times. And so sort of those, along with our remnants and our impressions and fossilized remnants, are all sort of evidences for what life used to look like relative to what it looks like now. Okay, and some of those things can be dated pretty precisely using carbon dating, using ice core samples. You can get a pretty good idea of when those things were occurring. Okay. We said that Alfred Russel Wallace was the father of biogeography. Biogeography is sort of a sub-branch of biology and geography, really, which is concerned with the geographical distribution of organisms. And so if we think about a time when the continents were actually in contact with each other, when in our geological history we were actually one big supercontinent, and then the continents split along their tectonic plates and moved. And so if you look at where fossils occur or where organisms occur, you can see sort of these evolutionary pathways of where continents were when they were connected, and then how they moved and when they moved based on how much diversion from that original starting point has occurred in those different places. And so these lines are representing, so we've got all of these continents, Africa, India, Australia, Antarctica, and South America, smushed together in a supercontinent. This particular species fossils are found along this yellow band. This species fossils are found along this peach band. This species fossils are found in the green, and this species is found in the blue. And so if we look at that distribution of organisms, we can sort of see how the continents used to be arranged relative to how they are arranged now. We can also look and see how specialized organisms that are found in certain areas. Those organisms that have been particularly isolated or that have been separate for very long periods of time are going to be very different, whereas those things that have been separated for shorter periods of time are going to be more similar across geographical distribution. Okay? So we can get some sort of relative history by looking at that geographical distribution and where similarities and differences occur. Does that make sense? Okay. We can also find evidence for evolution by looking as organisms change through the fossil record. So in a couple of weeks, we're going to go to college. They have a beautiful display of horse evolution that we're going to get to look at, where we can actually look at how a group of organisms evolved through time. This particular plate looks at sort of evolution from modern whales back to their land-dwelling ancestors. And so the evolutionary ancestors of modern whales lived on land, walked on four legs, and were relatively small-bodied compared to the size of modern whales. Right? They ventured into the water to forage, and as they spent more time in the water, became more aquatic adapted. Limbs that were used for walking became limbs that were used for swimming. The more swimming you do, the less you need your hind limbs, and the better off you are with a strong muscle and a flipper that allows you to be propelled through the water. And so you evolved from a four-legged walking terrestrial dwelling mammal to a swimming mammal with two front flippers. These hind limbs are still here, present in this little tiny leftover bone structure that is the remnants of what was the pelvic girdle, but this is no longer used, right, and has atrophied down to this very little remnant. And so being able to look at that pathway through time allows us to see how organisms have changed through geologic time. And looking at how those organisms are built, both through geologic time and how modern organisms are built, we can sort of see that evidence for that common ancestor. Right? So if we look at the fossilized wing of a pterodactyl, a bird, and a bat, the swimming limb of a dolphin and a seal, the running leg of a sheep and a dog, and the grasping hand of a shrew and a human, the bones that are similar are shown there in the same color. So the orange bone is the same bone, the humerus, in all of these organisms. We have the blue and purple here are the radius and ulna. The carpals are in green, the metacarpals are in pink, and the phalanges are in white. We have the same bones in all of these limbs, even though these limbs do really different things, right? If you were going to build the perfect body for any one of these organisms, you might not design these bones, right? If you were an engineer and you just wanted to make a running robot, you wouldn't necessarily give that robot a humerus and a radius and an ulna and metacarpals and carpals and phalanges. But if you had that to start with, over evolutionary time, you might be able to lengthen or shorten or combine or separate some of those bones into what you need. And when we look at horse evolution with Fred, we'll actually look at why you need some of those bones to be able to be separate versus together. It's very interesting to look at what the pressures are for bones to be longer or shorter, or fused or not fused. Okay, I'm going to just finish this slide and we'll stop here. Those structures that we see across evolutionary time that are synonymous and due to common ancestry are known as homologous structures. And so the prefix homo means same versus hetero, which is different. And so homologous structures are the same due to common ancestry. Okay? And so when we see these bones in the limbs of all of these different organisms, the human, the cat, the whale, the bat, the pterodactyl, that's a homologous structure. It's due to the fact that we are all descendants of some ancient vertebrate tetrapod that is our evolutionary ancestor back in the tree of life. They perform different functions now. The cat stands on its forelimb. We use our forelimb for grasping. Our primate cousins use that to swing from trees. They hold on to the branches with those grasping hands. A whale is going to use that same structure to propel itself through the water, and a bat is going to use that same structure to fly, right? So really, really different functions, but the same underlying structure due to common ancestry. That's a homologous structure. Okay. We will do a little bit more lecture today, but we're going to go do our lab activity first. And so we're going to take a break. We will meet in the lab at 2 o'clock. You can be a couple minutes late because we're a couple minutes late stopping here. But shortly after 2 o'clock, we'll start our activity. Feel free to sit with whoever you want to sit with. You're going to work in teams of 3 today. Okay, so try to sit with 3 people. There's a couple of tables that accommodate more than 3. We're going to move you to the front table as a separate group because I want 8 groups.